In our Nuxt apps, there are two main sources for errors during the rendering process. The first one is on the client side, and the second one is on the server side. First, we'll tackle the client side errors in this lesson and the next lesson, and then in the last two lessons in this chapter, we will tackle handling server-side errors. However, first I noticed that I missed something when we added types. So let's go in and add that type that I missed. We'll go into our use course composable here. And if I come down to where we actually have the composable, we'll see that we added this path in. And when we were adding types back in that lesson, I was so focused on the source data that I totally forgot about this field. So let's add that in right now before we forget. And that's all we needed to do. So now we can move on with client-side error handling. Nuxt 3 comes with this really useful NuxtErrorBoundary component. And what it does is it will capture any errors that happen in its default slot. This gives us a chance to show an error message and handle that error in a more specific way. So we can use these Nuxt error boundaries to actually isolate errors in different parts of our app instead of having a generic error page and just a generic way of handling these errors. So in our app, we're going to create an error when we click on this lesson complete button. We will use the createError method that Nuxt gives us. This method works on the client side as well as the server side, and it does exactly what it says it does. It creates an error for us. So if we come over here to our app and we open up our dev tools, go to the console. If I click on this toggle button here, we see that it throws the error, could not update. But we don't want this to happen. We don't want our app to just crash. We actually want to handle the error so that we can recover from it and so that our user can continue to use the app as we intended it to be used. So we'll add in the NuxtErrorBoundary component in our course page. And now when we come over to our app, I'll clear out these errors here so we can see what's going on. If I click on this button, we don't get an error in the console. That's because the NuxtErrorBoundary sort of absorbs that error. It catches it and prevents it from bubbling up even further to the rest of the app. You'll also notice that our lesson component completely disappeared here. That's because when NuxtErrorBoundary detects one of these errors, when it catches an error, it will switch from rendering the default slot and instead render the named error slot. So let's add that in now. As soon as we hit save, we see that our app updates to show this error message along with the error that we caught. Now, this error message is kind of vague and not descriptive, but because we have this error boundary around this Nuxt page, and we know that this page renders a lesson, we can give a more specific error message. If we didn't use the NuxtErrorBoundary component and instead just threw up a generic full page error, we probably wouldn't be able to know that something went wrong with the lesson specifically. And so our error message would have to be very vague. So now we've caught the error, but we want to recover from the error so that we can continue to use the application. To do that, we take this error object that the NuxtErrorBoundary component passes in to the scoped error slot here, and we reset that value back to null. So we'll add in a button here, and then we'll add in this reset error method. Now when we come over here and we click on this button, the error crashes this part of the app, but then we're able to click on this reset button, and we've restored the functionality of our app. One thing to note here is that if we don't clear this error, but we navigate to new pages, this error message is still shown. And the reason for that is this Nuxt page is the same page, and the course component that's being rendered is actually the same component because Nuxt reuses components intelligently. There's no point in destroying and recreating components unnecessarily, so we reuse as many things as we can. So what happens when we set this error back to null is the exact reverse of what happens when we caught the error in the first place. The error boundary component will re-display, it will re-render the component that's in our default slot. And if the error has been resolved, then this will work perfectly fine. Our component will be re-rendered and we'll be on our way. And in many cases, this will be all that you need. We just need to re-render, try again, and that's all that's needed to fix the error. However, in many cases, resolving the error is actually a bit more complicated, and so we need to do a bit more in order to resolve the error, and that's what we will cover in the next lesson. But before we move on, I need to point out something with this error variable. This error value is actually specific to this NuxtErrorBoundary component. In the lessons on server-side error handling, we'll see how we can use the useError and clearError methods to work with server-side errors in Nuxt. Those methods operate on server-side errors, not this error. This error here only exists on the client side, and the only way that we can interact with it is through this scoped slot here. So that's why we have to pass it from our scope slot into this error handling method here. So we'll cover these methods more in future lessons in this chapter, but I wanted to point that out in case it causes any confusion. All right, so now we've seen how we can handle client-side errors a bit. Let's move on and look at how we can resolve errors in a more advanced way.